So I'm going to begin by giving you some background on what people have been doing looking at nonlinear pulse propagation in multimode optical fibers recently. And I'm going to talk briefly about what are our motivations for this. And in fact, this work is very well motivated in terms of near-term and more speculative long-term applications. Then I'm going to focus specifically on a particularly simple experiment that turns out to be quite complex to analyze theoretically. And once I describe the experimental results and how we get them, I'm going to walk you through an understanding in terms of the complex mode coupling network. And we're going to use that to understand the spatial interactions between modes that lead to the nonlinear attractor that we and many other groups observe. And then we're going to talk about applying that in a non-rigorous way to understanding spatiotemporal mode coupling in that network. Then I'm going to talk about a speculative but very interesting possible application of this work, and I'll summarize. So as I said, there's lots of motivation for this work. In telecommunications, we're reaching the limits of single-mode fiber transmission, so people are looking at spatial division multiplexing and multimode fibers as a possible way forward. And that could be a route to many times higher bandwidth in telecommunication systems. We're looking at multimode fiber for ultrafast fiber lasers, and of course multimode fiber is already well used in many kinds of fiber lasers that are out in the market today. For optical imaging and biomedical context, you can think about using multimode fiber as an endoscopic imaging platform. And this is particularly exciting, I think, because you can imagine having almost completely non-invasive imaging inside highly scattering samples. So the size of a multimode optical fiber can be a sub-millimeter diameter glass tube. You could imagine using that like a needle, putting it into a sample, and really doing imaging deep into biological tissue. Later on, I'm going to talk to you about computing, or analog computing, or modeling systems. And of course, you could also use the spatiotemporal complexity or the spatiotemporal control possible in multimode fibers to create tailored ultrafast light sources. So what are we going to talk about today? The title is Self-Organized Instability, right? And what many people have seen so far is they've launched light into a multimode fiber, and what comes out is much cleaner than you would expect. Ordinarily, in a multimode fiber, you would expect to excite many different modes, and what comes out the output is a kind of speckled beam, a messy beam. It's not something that would generally be useful for applications that require a focused, diffraction-limited Gaussian beam. However, as people increase the energy going into the fiber, remarkably, we see that the energy tends to condense into this fundamental mode. And we get a nice Gaussian output beam for a particular range of output energies. And this has been seen in many different contexts by several different groups now. I saw it looking at anomalous dispersion, studying in particular multimode optical solitons, and looking at supercontinuum generation in anomalous dispersion graded index fibers. Cassie Krupa and co-workers at Limoges and University of Burgundy have seen it looking at normal dispersion with pretty long pulses. And in addition to seeing beam cleanup, they've also observed parametric instability termed geometric parametric instability. Rodrigo Correa's group at the University of Creole has seen this in supercontinuum generation, where they generated quite broad, flat supercontinuum with very high power and high spatial mode quality. So this could be a potential application immediately of this kind of work. Jean-Wei Liu in my group has seen it looking at femtosecond pulses in short graded index fibers. And there this work is exciting because we can think about using it for generating ultra-short pulses in multimode fiber lasers. And very recently, the Limoges group has seen it looking in partially graded index fiber amplifiers. And again, this gives us some hope and points us towards looking at multimode fiber laser applications, which I'm going to talk about later on. But going back to the current work, what do we see? So we see what everybody else sees. We're looking at quite long fibers compared to what everybody else does. And then there are some other details that are a little bit different. But one of the things that I want to emphasize throughout this whole talk is that while we're looking over a wide range of parameter space, we seem to be seeing very similar dynamics. And there's a question as to why this is the case. But here we see the same thing that everyone else is seeing. We see this beam cleanup process. We see energy going to the fundamental mode. As we increase the energy beyond that, however, we see the emergence of spatiotemporal complexity. And this is indeed what you would expect from thermodynamics, right? You expect that entropy is going to increase, so you don't expect this process of disorder decreasing, as we see here with the condensation or the beam cleanup process. You would expect the emergence of spatiotemporal complexity, and that is indeed what we see. So we're going to understand both of these. We have the self-organization, which is the nonlinear attractor, which is the energy going into the fundamental mode, and we have the instability, which is this spatiotemporal complexity that we observe. So there's a lot of questions here, right? What exactly is this beam cleanup? And what is this process that's happening after the beam cleanup? What is this spatiotemporal complexity or spatiotemporal instability that we observe? And finally, something that is very important for applications, for practical uses, and for doing real experiments is we have to ask ourselves, what is the role of disorder in the fiber? And this is a very palpable process. So if we're looking at long fibers and short wavelengths as we are here, the motivation for that is the short wavelength is going to allow disorder to be a much more relevant effect. And that comes just from the scaling of most scattering type processes. Most everybody else has been looking at 1550 nanometers in the anomalous dispersion regime, or at around 1 micron, 1000 nanometers. And here we're looking at 532 nanometers. So we're going to be getting considerably stronger effects of disorder. In addition to that, because the fiber is much longer, we just have a much longer range for that disorder to build up. But once you add in all this disorder, things start to get very complicated very quickly. So this is a complex network. Right? There's coupling between all these different eigenmodes, quite a few of them, and there's different sorts of coupling. For example, there's dissipative type processes, there's nonlinear processes, and of course there's this disordered process that we're introducing through the refractive index inhomogeneity of the glass waveguide. Fortunately, as I had before, there's many examples of complex networks in nature. And a field has developed to study these. This is the world of complexity science or complex networks. And in particular, many networks of interest are so-called small world networks. And these are networks where coupling is primarily to nearest neighbors or it's locally connected, and there are a few shortcut coupling. And it turns out that multimode fiber is essentially a small world network also. As I said, there's many different elements, there's many different nodes in this system, and these are the modes of the fiber, these spatial eigenmodes. So here's a few of what they look like. These are the field intensity profiles. And with that said, let's look at exactly what we see in the experiment. So the experiment is quite simple. Light comes out of this Q-switched microchip laser, and we control the power using a half-wave plate and a polarization beam splitter. That light goes into the graded index multimode fiber, and we can control to some extent what modes we excite by translating the fiber with a 3-axis translation stage. Now, at low power, what comes out is something like this. And it's a little bit difficult to see perhaps, but you can see that there's a speckle pattern. There's lots of different lobes and structure in this spectrum, in this beam profile. It's not something that would be useful for many applications that require a high spatial quality Gaussian mode. However, as the energy going into the fiber increases, something quite interesting happens. And this is this self-organization that we're talking about. You can see we now get this nice Gaussian mode. So quantitatively, it looks like this. As we increase the energy, you can see the evolution of the spectrum and the beam profile. And as the energy goes up and up, we see the confluence of different nonlinear and dissipative processes lead to energy across the spectrum condensing into that fundamental mode. Now, what happens after that is pretty interesting. As we increase the energy further, the beam actually expands, and we see a symmetric broadening of the field in space. And this corresponds to the development of spectral sidebands here in the spectrum. So this is a clue that we have a spatiotemporal instability going on. And just to see that in the experiment, you see here on the optical spectrum analyzer, we do indeed see these spectral sidebands. So there's a lot of different processes going on. As I've said several times, this is a complex nonlinear optical pulse propagation problem. But there's this Raman cascade right in the center. But what I want to draw your attention to, although the Raman cascade is important for the emergence of this nonlinear attractor, is the spatiotemporal modulation stability sidebands over at the side. To just prove to you a little bit that those are exactly what they are, we're taking theory that was more or less done by Arash Mafia's group and comparing it to what we see in the experiment, and indeed it looks like spatiotemporal modulation instability if we assume the nonlinear attractor, which is the fundamental mode of the fiber, is the pump. And we can compare what we expect from theory to experiment by measuring also the spatiospectral profile. And this is done by just focusing the light using a cylindrical lens and scanning along the unfocused dimension with a fiber-coupled optical spectrum analyzer. So this is exactly what we see in the experiment. But you might be asking yourself now, if you appreciate what an nonlinear attractor is, it's something that the field tends to go to for many different initial conditions. That's something that seems to be very stable. What we're saying is we have here a nonlinear attractor which is unstable. So there's something to be understood here. So this is the question I want you to keep in mind as we go through understanding the origin of this nonlinear attractor in general, and then we're going to understand exactly how it can be also unstable. So the way that we're going to do that is with coupled mode theory, or perturbation theory, as so often happens in physics. And what we do with this is we have the evolution of the complex mode amplitudes. It follows an equation that looks like this, where the modes are coupled together by some perturbation to the ideal refractive index profile. So we have the coupling between the different modes is a function of the longitudinal coordinate, and it's determined by this refractive index perturbation, where n0 is the ideal refractive index profile, and these guys over here are the modes. Now, not only is the transverse inhomogeneity important, but the longitudinal variation of that perturbation is very important. And it's very important because it determines what kinds of modes are going to be phase matched with one another. If you're familiar with something like the long period Bragg grating, which allows coupling, for example, between different particular eigenmodes in a multimode fiber, you may recognize this kind of idea. And this is, in fact, precisely how the long period Bragg grating works. So the take-home, really, here is that the overlap between the different modes of the perturbation is going to control their coupling, but so also is the longitudinal changes in that perturbation. So in a multimode fiber, we have something that looks like this, and in particular a parabolic fiber. It's a simple harmonic oscillator type structure, and we have degenerate modes. These are the propagation constants that we're plotting here. We have degenerate mode groups, as you see, and as you go to larger and larger R, that is further and further from the center of the fiber, you're going to higher and higher order modes on average. Now, if we go back to what we did before and we consider a Kerr-type nonlinearity that is proportional to the local intensity of the light, and we compute on average the mode coupling matrix, that is what we're plotting here, we see that there's an interesting structure to it. And there's a lot of interesting details to be extracted from this, but what I want to emphasize right now is just that the magnitude of these coupling coefficients increases as we go from low to higher order modes. In other words, if we apply this directed network onto what we were looking at before, which is the modes in the fiber, we see that there is a bias of energy going towards the lower order modes. And very importantly, this is exactly how Raman behaves as well. So this underlies how we can have irreversible behavior in this type of system, where energy goes to the fundamental mode and it doesn't go back to the higher order modes, as you would expect in a conservative system, as I'm going to explain in a little bit. So in a conservative system, if this is the average nonlinear potential, we should expect merely oscillations. We shouldn't expect the behavior where, for example, light launched in up here is going to end up at the center of the fiber, and it's just going to stay there indefinitely. This is an irreversible type behavior that is unexpected in a conservative or a Hamiltonian type system. But with this kind of physical analogy, we can understand the role of nonlinearity. If this is the average nonlinear potential, this is a higher order mode, this is the fundamental mode, intuitively you can see immediately, and it turns out to be the case theoretically, that higher order modes are in general unstable to a wide variety of symmetry-breaking perturbations, whereas the fundamental mode, in the presence of nonlinearity, is completely stable. As a result, if you launch in anything but the pure fundamental mode, the expectation is something like this. You'll see the energy slosh back and forth. You'll see these periodic oscillations. In fact, exactly what you would expect if you launched light into a perfectly linear fiber. But even in experiments where we're really dealing with very conservative systems, there's very little dissipation, there's essentially zero disorder, we still see some irreversibility. And this is a question that often comes up, so I want to explain exactly where that's coming from. And a physical analogy for understanding this is something like this, and I'll explain what it exactly corresponds to in a minute. Previously, we're looking at this average nonlinear potential, and are imagining the energy in the fiber to be this particular point particle. If we imagine that point particle has some mass, like this duck, it can deform elastically the potential. And as time evolution of the system goes, it's going to go like this, and it's going to get stuck at the bottom. The system can still be fully conservative, but it can have some amount of irreversibility all the same. And in the experiments with conservative systems, what this weight, what this deformation corresponds to is the local development of nonlinear phase in the fundamental mode. That is, the fundamental mode is the most intense mode. It gets nonlinear phase shift the fastest, and that causes a decoherence with the higher order modes, and as a result we don't see energy sloshing back and forth. We eventually see irreversible energy condensation in the fundamental mode. Now, what we're concerned with in the experiments that I've been doing is a system that has strong disorder and dissipation. And of course those things make the system completely non-conservative, and so we have a much simpler explanation, which is we just have this kind of biased random walk down to the bottom of that potential well. So what are we looking at now here? We have this role of nonlinearity, which is a biased mode coupling, biased directed network, and we have disorder, which is interacting with the nonlinearity. And overall, especially at low powers, what we find is that disorder enhances beam cleanup. And the way that it does that in particular is it couples the higher order modes to the cladding, so it increases their loss, but it also enhances the nonlinear instability of those higher order modes, and that's what I'll explain. So just to prove what I mean, of course we see it in experiment, but in simulation when we add disorder controllably, this is the average mode number or the average population of the mode. We see that it's decreasing rapidly with disorder and decreasing much more slowly without disorder. So where does this come from? One place it comes from is the nonlinear instability of the higher order modes. Here we're looking at the propagation of the 35th mode and a very weak background of all the other modes. And without disorder, despite being nonlinearly unstable, it sure seems pretty stable at this power level. When we add disorder in, things are totally different, and we immediately get very high disorder, nonlinear mode mixing between all these different modes, and we will eventually see beam cleanup. However, at higher power, things are not so cut and dry. Without disorder, there is indeed higher order mode instability, and with disorder, things are a little bit different, but you wouldn't really notice this in experiment. So the point is, overall, that disorder is actually quite important at low power for enhancing beam cleanup, but it is a very small influence when you get to the higher powers. And the way that it really works is it seeds the nonlinear instability of the higher order modes. Alright, so that's the nonlinear attractor, and that's the nonlinear attractor across the whole range of parameter space. But we still have to understand this spatiotemporal instability. Remember, I talked about this before. How can a nonlinear attractor be unstable? So we're now going to add coupling to time. Remember this mode picture, right? What we're going to do is find a way to generalize this to not only a single frequency, but to many different frequencies. And how that's going to look in a qualitative picture is we're going to take that same coupled mode theory that we did before. We're going to do everything the same, but we're now going to let the phase matching condition be a function of the two frequencies. That is, we're going to allow chromatic dispersion to be a parameter here. And what that looks like in terms of our complex network is we now have this manifold continuous degree of freedom on the frequency. For normal dispersion, as we increase omega n from omega m, that's going to look like this. And you can see that for particular omega n and omega m, there's going to be strong coupling between particular mode groups at different frequencies. So here you see mode group 1 is going to be coupled to mode group 2 at omega n. And there's going to be many like that. And because the nonlinear mode coupling coefficients for the fundamental mode are the strongest, it's also going to be the most spatiotemporally unstable. And in fact, it's exactly what we see in numerical simulations. You can see there's several orders of magnitude, actually quite a few orders of magnitude, stronger instability for the fundamental mode, which is the nonlinear tractor. So the nonlinear tractor is the most spatiotemporally unstable state of the system. To summarize all that, what we see is energy from all the other modes accumulates in the fundamental mode. But the fundamental mode is the most intense, it's the nonlinear tractor, but it turns out to be the most spatiotemporally unstable state of the system for many different reasons that are all related to it being this nonlinear tractor in space. We see that disorder enhances the nonlinear tractor at low powers, and overall we see this for a wide range of different parameters, including a wide range of different initial conditions going into the fiber. So all this different stuff that we see can, in a qualitative way, in an intuitive way, be understood in terms of this directed complex coupling network between the modes. Pictorially, that looks like this. As we increase the energy, we go from energy flowing into the fundamental mode, this nonlinear tractor, the self-organization. As we increase the energy beyond that, we have the emergence of spatiotemporal instability, self-organized instability. So as I promised, I'm going to talk about one application that's a little bit speculative, but I think you'll appreciate why it's also very exciting. So these days, everyone's interested in deep learning or neural networks, machine learning. And something that's interesting about multimode fibers is it's a reconfigurable complex network. And exactly how is it reconfigurable? Well, we have control over this index perturbation. For example, imagine a strong pump beam determines the intensity in the fiber as a function of x, y, and z. In that case, we can fully specify for a weak probe beam what is the complex coupling network in the fiber. And what this means is we have a laboratory, very high-dimensional complex coupling network. And you could imagine using that as a kind of analog computer to simulate different complex systems, or you could do controlled experiments in complexity science. And because complexity science and related to data science, these are really based on natural experiments or observational type experiments, having this kind of controlled laboratory testbed is something that I think moving into the future where these fields are very important is potentially something that is actually very useful and is actually very important from a philosophy of science perspective. Now, with that said, let me summarize. So nonlinearity, disorder, and dissipation are all important. They all couple modes together in graded index multimode fibers. And we can understand how all these guys work together to create a spatial nonlinear tractor that causes energy to accumulate into the fundamental mode over a wide range of different parameters and initial conditions. Furthermore, they lead us to believe and lead us to understand and to observe that the fundamental mode is the most spatiotemporally unstable state, and it succumbs to spatiotemporal modulation instability. The common characteristics of this complex coupling network underlie the similar behavior that is observed across a quite wide range of parameter space and parabolic fibers, so they tie together all these different kinds of experiments. Finally, pulse propagation in multimode fibers is a reconfigurable, experimentally accessible complex network. And this talk is just an advertisement. It's gone a little bit longer than I expected, and maybe that you expected, but there's still a lot more details in this paper, which I encourage you to read if you're interested. I want to thank my co-authors and my funding sources. And if you're even more interested, I really encourage you to read all these different kinds of papers in this area. There's a lot of good work, certainly not just by our group. Thanks.